Hi, everyone, and welcome to week 2. This is your lecture for document design, COM 350, COM 525. Glad to see you all back, and I hope that you're meeting some of your fellow students out on the discussion boards. I look forward to reading and responding to yours as well. In this week, we want to talk a little bit about what document design is. And as you're going through this course and even reading on your own, you're going to see that people have different definitions of what document design is. So I want to talk first about Shriver. Shriver says that creating text that integrate words and pictures enable people to achieve specific goals for using text. Now, in comparison, Kimball and Hawkins say part of the general field of information design, which is about relationships among people who create information and use information, and their cultures and environments. So it's part of that general field of information design. And I'm not going to say too much about that in depth because I really want to see how this discussion unravels on the discussion boards. I, of course, will be chiming in, and just remember to post your view in response to the questions, and then also make sure that you're commenting on your other students as well. So the discussion question, as a reminder, is to think about the relationship between and compare the two definitions. So again, make sure that you're posting on time and then giving your fellow students enough time to post back to you. So we want to talk a little bit more about Shriver. Shriver was publishing around the 90s, and Shriver had published an article called Document Design in the Technical Communication Journal. If you're not familiar with that, that is a journal that is still around today. It's going to be a good source for you guys to look at in the future, especially some of my graduate students. You want to make sure that you're starting to gather what technical journals are out there that you can use. And what Shriver was explaining in this article was different areas that impact document design. There's some maybe obvious ones to you. Think about rhetoric. We talked about that in week 1. That's one that definitely comes into play. But Shriver also said that it's impacted by pop psychology, by linguistics, by sociocultural influences. All those things influence document design. And now, to go along with that, we kind of want to take a step back from the 90s and maybe go more to 1960s. And we're talking about early help manuals. Early help manuals used to follow more of what they call a kitchen sink policy. It's all of the information thrown in. It doesn't matter even if the user is going to need that information. So it's any information that the company developing that product had. And oftentimes the writer was not a technical communicator or a technical writer. It was someone who was maybe working on the project or the product, maybe was an engineer. So it might not be someone that has the best grasp of how to communicate the information, but it was someone that knew the product well enough. And over time, they realized a need to provide something better. They realized that they needed user feedback, and that's something that they weren't getting. So as companies tried to get user feedback, we came out with things like the feedback card. And feedback cards are great, but they can also be hard to get feedback on. You're relying on a user submitting that. Now a lot of it's electronic, or companies are doing usability testing. We're going to talk about that a lot more. But at that time, the only option was a feedback card, and that was somewhat unreliable. So the really critical component that's missing in all of this technical communication is really the usability portion, that user feedback. So you can see I have as the first bullet that feedback from the user is invaluable. That's still true today. A lot of companies do usability testing. Definitely on their product, not always on documentation. Documentation, There's not always time. It depends on what sort of release cycle you're on, especially if you're on a technical product. Now that we're on the cloud a lot rather than on premise, there's a lot of times where you don't have a long review period. You don't have time to test the documentation. You're writing something every month and updating it. So there's not as much usability testing and documentation as compared to elsewhere in the IT fields. But so usability testing starts to gain some ground, and there's new research centers that you see popping up. So we have the Document Design Center in Washington, D.C., and we have the Communication Design Center at Carnegie Mellon. Those two still exist today. You can always look them up. And we see new researchers coming into play. You can see I have Jakob Nielsen down here. Some will call him the king of usability. You can see that online. And he's someone that is still doing research today, very popular in that field. And we're going to be reading some of his articles that are on the web today. But Jakob Nielsen, Jared Spool, these are names that are going to come up with usability testing. They did a lot of research on that. And also Shriver, half of her book is based or is surrounding usability testing. And you might be thinking, well, she was writing in the 90s, is that still going to be relevant? Because things change so quickly in technology. But when we're looking at usability testing, those core concepts aren't changing as much. So you'll see as we go further in the project and even do the usability project at the second end of this quarter, that all of those concepts, all of those methods, those are still true and they're still valid. You can still follow a method that she lays out and do successful user testing. So with that research from Nielsen and Spool, we find out that readers now, rather than comparison to the 60s, don't want to wade through all of the information. They're not interested in the kitchen sink approach where all the information is given to them up front and they have to do the work to find it. They want the information that they need, but they also want to be able to navigate that information. You're going to see that when we talk about usability testing on the web. People don't go to a web page and read it from start to finish. Generally, you're looking for something, maybe you clicked on an article and you came through some sort of social media site. In that case, you're probably just skimming your article and going on your way. If you're doing some type of research, you're likely using a search field. Again, those are all ways to navigate. Help systems might still have a TOC on one of the either the left or right hand side that you might be clicking through as a user. So those things are all going to impact the way that documents are designed. And now, even modern day, we still have different issues and problems and concerns that come up. So I want to go through a few of them that are right here. And that's intercultural, localization, and accessibility. Now, intercultural and localization, they have to do with the translatability of your document. There can be two approaches to this. Well, maybe three. One could be that the company does not translate to another language. I've seen companies that do that they say, well, enough people in the other country that we're marketing in speak English and are able to work with the program, so we're not going to translate the content. There's also another approach that anything that is written by the technical communicator is translated as is, or it can be localized to that specific country. So that's where examples, names, they might change based on what that country is used to. So say you were using an American name, but now you're publishing in Korean. You may want to put that as a variable, and that's something that's going to change in the text. You might want to use a variable, and then there's a more popular name in Korean. And a lot of times companies are going to depend highly on their translating services. You're not going out and using a free service in most cases that reads as very machiney. But there are different approaches that companies can take. And if you're interested in that as a topic, it's certainly worth exploring. And I'm also happy to talk to you about what I do at my company for translation, but I don't want to go too much into it right here because I know that's not the main focus of the course. But if it's something that you're interested in talking about, definitely reach out to me. And one of the other things I do at my company is accessibility. So we're talking about, they say WCAG 3.0. So it's Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. These are guidelines to make sure that your content is accessible to all users. You can see I included a little screenshot here for JAWS. JAWS is a screen reading software. It's something that I use for my work. I've been trained to use it. This is software that is usually used if you are visually impaired, possibly to the extent that you're blind. So documentation has to meet these standards too. If you are documenting for maybe an application, some sort of software, the software has to meet these guidelines, but your documentation does as well. The documentation is only going to be good to someone if it's going to be accessible. One of the most accessible formats is HTML. PDFs, they're very hard to make accessible. Excel, it's doable, but it's hard to make accessible. Even video content is great. I fully support that as a means of technical communication, but you're looking at things like putting on closed captioning. If you're doing translating, you need to translate those captions. And you also need to make sure that you're providing a script to the reader. You have to always provide something else that a user can use if they can't see or hear your video. Some other issues, font resizing. We already talked about if a user was blind, but what if they just can't see it? You usually have to be able to resize up to 200%, and that still needs to be legible on the screen. And those are real requirements. Throughout my accessibility work at my company, I've found people that work on screens like that. So there are people out there who need this extra help. We're also talking about color blindness. One of the rules is that color cannot convey information. If you have two lines on a graph or a chart, and I'm saying, okay, the red line means this and the orange line means that, that's going to be very hard for someone who's colorblind to tell. They might be able to tell different shades of gray, but again, it's something that we need to tell them up front. You could easily solve this problem by putting a label on each of the lines. And again, every time you're using some sort of a chart in technical communication, you still have to provide the textual meaning as well. And again, that's going to be for accessibility for people who can't see the pictures. So that goes right into charts, pictures, and reports. Anytime you use them in your technical documentation, you need to explain to the user what is in that. A lot of companies will use screenshots and then label them. Those are great for users who can see, but for a user who cannot see, all they're getting is really just the text. So we need to make sure that as technical communicators, we have enough information for that user to say, okay, I can kind of visualize what you're talking about. You're telling me that there's a top level menu and there's a sidebar navigation. So we need to also, as communicators, make sure that we're choosing the right terms. And documentation needs to be accessible for more than just the ability of anyone to access the content. That is one of the primary reasons, and it should be very important to a company. But there's also different standards for government agencies. A lot of them have standards that if your company is not WCAG compliant, they cannot purchase your software. Or they might have an option where we can purchase your software, but we have a user who needs some sort of assistance, and our reasonable workaround is to hire someone else to help them. That's come up before in some of the clients that different IT companies have. So it is something that can impact your clients. And again, we're talking both about the actual program and the documentation that goes along with it. So that's definitely something that's going to keep coming up in the future. Again, this is a really interesting topic. I could go on for a long time about that. There could be a course in and of itself, but that's something that if you're interested in focusing on that on one of your projects, I definitely recommend it. Very interesting field, a lot of information with that. So this concludes this part of the lecture. Thanks for hanging in there. We're going to get started with the next one soon. Again, sorry, these are a little bit broken up. We're going to try to merge them together better in the future, but stay tuned and I will see you in the next lecture.